Morning scripture reading is taken from Acts chapter 15, verses 36 through 41. Acts 15, verses 36 through 41. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went to Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Our Father in heaven, we are grateful today to be able to be here and to study your word. We're grateful to be able to sing songs of praise to you. We're grateful for the bright sunshine today. Father, as we feel the cool, crisp mornings and evenings, we know the fall is on the way. Reminds us again, Father, that you are in control of this world. We're mindful, Father, of those of our number that are not feeling well. We ask that you would be with them, help them to be able to be back here amongst us. with the leaders of our company and other leaders around the world, Father, help them to make wise decisions. We pray that we might be able to be able to live in peace. This is the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
Number 703. 703. I love you with the Lord. Love me with the love of the Lord. Love me with the love of the Lord. If you want to hear God's will, then the need you must fulfill is to love me with the love of the Lord. He loves me with the love of the Lord. He loves me with the love of the Lord. My debts were all paid when he rose up from the grave, and he loves me with the love of the Lord. Psalm 11, 611. Walking in sunlight, all of my journey, over the mountains, through the deep vale, Jesus has said, I'll never forsake thee, promise divine that never can fail. Heavenly sunlight, heavenly sunlight, flooding my soul with glory divine. Hallelujah, I am rejoicing, singing his praises. Jesus is mine. Shadows around me, shadows above me, never conceal my Savior and guide. He is the light in midst of darkness, ever I'm walking close to his side. Heavenly sunlight, heavenly sunlight, lighting my soul with glory divine. Hallelujah, I am rejoicing, singing his praises. Jesus is mine. The bright sunlight, ever rejoicing, pressing my way to mansions above, singing his praises. Gladly I'm walking, walking in sunlight, sunlight of love. Heavenly sunlight, heavenly sunlight, singing his praises. Jesus is mine. Worship the King, all glorious above, and gratefully sing his wonderful love. Our shield and defender, the ancient of days, pavilion in splendor and girded with praise. Bountiful care, what tongue can recite? It breathes in the air, it shines in the light. It sings from the hills, it descends to the plain, and sweetly distills in the dew and the rain. Children of dust and people as frail, in thee do we trust, nor find thee to fail. Thy mercies how tender, how firm to the end, our Maker, Defender, Redeemer, and Friend.
Mark number 674, 674.
Praise thee, O God, for the Son of thy love, for Jesus who died and is now gone above. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. Praise thee, O God, for thy Spirit of life, who has shown us our Savior and scattered our night. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. Glory and praise to the Lamb that was slain, who has borne all our sins and has cleansed every stain. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. All glory and praise to the God of all grace, who has bought us and sought us and guided our ways. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. Revive us again. Fill each heart with thy love. May each soul be rekindled with fire from above. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again.
If you've noticed back there, there's a sign on the wall that says turn mic on. That is for me to remember to turn this mic on when I leave the pulpit. Um, I wrote one for myself here in front of me. So let's open up to Proverbs chapter 1. That's where we're going to be. We're spending some time in the Proverbs over these next few weeks. So we're going to look at another section here of chapter 1. But just to give us a little bit of context, verse 1 of chapter 1 indicates that this collection of Proverbs were written by Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel. Now, furthermore, what verses 2 and 3 of this chapter indicate is that one of the main purposes Solomon wrote these Proverbs is so that his readers might know wisdom and instruction and discern the sayings of understanding and to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, is what verses 2 and 3 tell us. Now, what these things tell us then is that one of the main things Solomon wished to impart in his Proverbs was and is wisdom. Now, since that's the case, as we reach verse 20 of this chapter, Solomon now personifies wisdom and says, "Wisdom shouts in the street, she lifts her voice in the square." Now, as we see in the text of this verse, here Solomon is picturing wisdom as a woman who is shouting in the street and lifting her voice in the square. Now, in other words, what Solomon is doing here is picturing wisdom as this woman who is publicly shouting in public areas, which in this case are the streets, and in what this text refers to as the square. The square is what we might call a city square, a place where people commonly gather together in public. And so what Solomon says here in verse 20 refers to the fact that wisdom is seeking to get the attention of those it is shouting out to with its own voice. Now, sometimes our little Attaby, or even Jenny in some cases, will say, "Mom, Mom, Mom, Mom," and eventually, "Mom!" Just like that. That's what Solomon is saying in verse 20 about wisdom. That wisdom is shouting out to get the attention of its hearers. So it is these things then that set the stage for what Solomon will go on to record in verses 21 through 33 of this chapter, concerning what verse 20 could refer to as the voice of wisdom. So it's this point about the voice of wisdom that we're going to spend time with as we examine 3 points that Solomon makes in verses 21 through 33 about this voice of wisdom. The first point Solomon makes in verses 21 and 22 is that the voice of wisdom asks questions. The second point Solomon makes in verses 23 through 27 is that the voice of wisdom calls out. And finally, the third point Solomon makes in verses 28 through 33 is that the voice of wisdom is called on. Now, after looking at these things, the question these verses will leave us with is, will we respond to the voice of wisdom? So that in mind, we'll begin our examination of these things by reading through these verses, and then we'll look at the points. Again, this is Proverbs chapter 1, beginning in verse 21, we read, "At the head of the noisy street she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city she utters her sayings. How long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. Turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. Because I called and you refused, I stretched out my hand and no one paid attention. And you neglected all my counsel and did not want my reproof. I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your dread comes like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. Then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would not accept my counsel, they spurned all my reproof. So they shall eat of the fruit of their own way, and be satiated with their own devices. For the waywardness of the naive will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But he who listens to me shall live securely, and will be at ease from the dread of evil. So again, we're looking at this concept that was presented in verse 20 concerning the voice of wisdom. Well, what does the voice of wisdom do? First of all, it asks questions. Beginning in verse 21, again, Solomon is still picturing the voice of wisdom as a woman. He now says she is at the head of the noisy streets, crying out, and who is standing at the entrance of the gates in the city, uttering what she is saying. Now, as we see in the text, here in verse 21, Solomon is continuing to picture the voice of wisdom as a woman. She's in two different places, saying what she has to say. Now, with that in mind, the first place Solomon pictures the voice of wisdom as being is at the head of the noisy streets. That goes back to verse 20, the street idea. Lots of people gathered. Similar to that, the second place, the entrance of the gates in the city, is also a place where lots of people would be gathered. This is a time when Solomon is living in a time when there's walled cities, and in those walls there's gates to go into the city. Very popular place for people to gather. But applying that here, Solomon is making the point that the voice of wisdom is something that can be heard, even in the most public of places. Now, one reason this is important to remember is because in today's society, sometimes wisdom is often treated, well, only just a select few can have wisdom. But this verse says that wisdom is something that is available to everybody, if people will take the time to hear its voice and what it has to say. So having made that point, in verse 22, Solomon goes on to give an example of something the voice of wisdom has to say, where it's a question. How long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? Second question. And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. Now in this verse, Solomon is presenting two rhetorical questions that the voice of wisdom might ask of the people named in these questions. So that being the case, one thing we should understand here is that the people named in these two questions, the naive and the scoffers, they are people who have rejected the voice of wisdom. They've rejected what the voice of wisdom has to say. Why? Because they enjoy being in the condition they're in. They love being naive. They love being scoffers. Now we know that because these words, love and delight, they're parallel terms that carry with them the idea of enjoyment. And so in these questions, Solomon is asking, how long are you going to enjoy being naive? Scoffers, how long are you going to enjoy scoffing or mocking at and foolishly hating knowledge? But in asking these questions, what the voice of wisdom is doing is calling these people, these naive and these scoffers, to turn from the condition that they're in. And so what does this tell us about the voice of wisdom? The voice of wisdom asks questions. Now in these verses, Solomon has shown that the voice of one thing the voice of wisdom does is ask questions. Now what Solomon has also shown in these verses is that the kinds of questions that the voice of wisdom asks are questions that deal with how long people will reject what the voice of wisdom has to say. In response to these questions, then, the person hearing these questions is challenged to reflect on whether or not they need to change their condition. Their condition of not having wisdom to now changing it to having wisdom. So that brings us to verses 23 through 27. The voice of wisdom calls out. Now this point is introduced with Solomon recording in verse 23. another statement from the voice of wisdom. The voice of wisdom is calling those who will hear to turn to its reproof, with the result being that the voice of wisdom would pour out its spirit on those who will listen and make its word known to those who will listen. So here in verse 23, Solomon, he's recording a call from the voice of wisdom. The voice of wisdom is calling its hearers to change their direction toward what the text calls the voice of wisdom's reproof, with the knowledge that if they did, they would receive the spirit and the words of the voice of wisdom. So that in mind, one thing we should understand here is that this word reproof, it's similar to the word rebuke. It's a word that carries with it the idea of strong correction. So here, the voice of wisdom is calling its listeners to change their direction and allow themselves to be corrected by this voice of wisdom. And the result of that is that the voice of wisdom will give its spirit and its words to those who will listen. So we have to ask, well, what does this word spirit have to do with? In this context, the word spirit is the mind and heart of the voice of wisdom. And then we have the words, the things the voice of wisdom has to say. So the point here is that if people would turn and allow themselves to be corrected by the voice of wisdom, then those people would have the mind and heart of the voice of wisdom, as well as its words within themselves. But even though that's the case, verse 24 presents another scenario. Solomon goes on to record in verse 24, or he records the voice of wisdom as saying in verse 24 that it called, but its listeners refused, that it stretched out its hand and no one paid attention. Now in this verse, Solomon is recording the voice of wisdom as saying that even though it called out, its listeners were unwilling to listen. And even though it reached out with its hands, it still was not listened to. But he uses the word because in this verse. That word because indicates that what Solomon records here is the beginning of a thought or a warning that the voice of wisdom is issuing to its listeners as to what is going to happen as a result of its listeners rejecting what it has to say. So that being true, in verse 25, Solomon continues the thought of verse 24 by continuing to paint the picture of how the voice of wisdom was rejected by its listeners, where its listeners neglected all its counsel and did not want its reproof. So continuing with the thought of verse 24, what Solomon records here in verse 25 carries with it the idea that its listeners ignored everything the voice of wisdom had to offer. And more specifically, they ignored all the advice it had to offer and did not accept its correction. Now, as this builds on verse 24, what is said here in verse 25 continues the warning that something was going to happen to these people as a result of rejecting the voice of wisdom that was calling out to them. And so in verse 26, Solomon goes on to record what the voice of wisdom was going to do in response to its listeners for rejecting it. And the text says that the voice of wisdom would laugh at the things that were going to happen to those who rejected it and mock those to whom these things were happening. So here in verse 26, Solomon is recording a thought that extends through verse 27, where he's now picturing the voice of wisdom as laughing at what was going to happen to those who rejected it, which in this verse is calamity and dread. Those two words are used. So that in mind, one thing we should understand here is that the words calamity and dread, they're parallel words that deal both with disaster and the fear that comes as a result of that disaster. But here, applying that here, Solomon is recording the voice of wisdom as saying, I'm going to laugh at the disaster that comes to those who rejected that voice of wisdom and mock these individuals for being afraid when that disaster comes. Having made that point in verse 27, the thought of verse 26 is continued using the images of a storm and a whirlwind, and those images are used to describe both the dread and the calamity that was coming to those who rejected the voice of wisdom, with the result being that distress and anguish would come upon those who rejected that voice. So in this verse, Solomon is now picturing the voice of wisdom as illustrating what was coming to those who rejected the voice of wisdom. What was coming to those who rejected the voice of wisdom was violent in nature. The same violence that we might see in a windstorm or a hurricane. Now, as this ties in with verse 26, the point here is the same, which is that the voice of wisdom would laugh and mock at what was going to happen to those who rejected it. So what we should understand from these things then is that the reason the voice of wisdom was going to be laughing and mocking at these people is because it already offered to its listeners the chance to escape that dread, the chance to escape that calamity. But its listeners refused to listen. And the result then is that those who rejected the voice of wisdom would experience distress, anguish, which is a way of saying that they would experience great difficulty, all because they rejected the voice of wisdom. And so putting verses 23 through 27 together, the point we should see from these verses is that the voice of wisdom calls out. In these verses, Solomon has shown that the voice of wisdom is something that calls out to others. And again, we've already seen that this calling out happens in a very public manner. But even though that's the case, even though it calls out, these verses show us that most will reject it. But not only will they reject it, they will suffer the consequences for that rejection. Since that's true, these verses also function as a warning for us to accept the voice of wisdom and what it has to say, and a warning of what will happen if we reject it. So that brings us into verses 28 through 32, the third point about the voice of wisdom. It is called on and searched for. So this point is introduced with Solomon recording in verse 28 that as a result of what would happen to those who rejected the voice of wisdom, at that point, those people would call on the voice of wisdom, but the text says the voice of wisdom would not answer. And even though these people searched for it diligently, they did not find the voice of wisdom. So now Solomon is turning his attention to those who rejected the voice of wisdom. They've suffered the consequences, and now they're calling out to the voice of wisdom. But they're not getting an answer. They're looking for the voice of wisdom, but they're not finding it. Now, context indicates that the reason these people are unable to get a response, the reason they're not able to find the voice of wisdom, is because at this point, they have lost the opportunity the voice of wisdom was offering to them before these things happened. So in short, at this point, it was too late to call out to the voice of wisdom. But this does not change the fact that those who had rejected the voice of wisdom still tried to call out to it. But then in verse 29, Solomon tells us why verse 28 is true. They failed to receive a response. The reason they failed to find the voice, verse 29 says, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. Now in this verse, Solomon is returning to one of the main themes of the book of Proverbs, knowledge, as it ties in with the fear of the Lord. Now more specifically, what is said here recalls what we read in verse 7 of this chapter. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now applying those concepts here, Solomon is making the point that the reason the voice of wisdom did not respond, and the reason it could not be found, is because those calling to it and searching for it wanted nothing to do with knowledge. And they made a choice to reject the fear of the Lord. Now, what that means is that the reason the voice of wisdom did not respond to those calling to it, and the reason it did not allow itself to be found by those searching for it, is because these people did not have what was necessary for it to answer and to be found. If you're going to be answered by the voice of wisdom, if you're going to find the voice of wisdom, what you need is the knowledge that comes through having a fear of the Lord. Now, what this tells us then is that if a person does not have this fear of the Lord, then it's impossible to receive wisdom and knowledge. Because wisdom and knowledge, true wisdom and true knowledge, in other words, are only available to those who have this fear of the Lord. You have to have the fear of the Lord if you want this knowledge that this verse speaks of. And so since people chose not to accept those things, it's for this reason that in verse 30, Solomon says that these people would not accept the counsel of the voice of wisdom, and they spurned its reproof. Now in this verse, Solomon is making the point that the people described in verses 28 and 29, they rejected the advice offered by the voice of wisdom, and they looked down on the correction that it offered. Now, as this builds on verse 29, what is said here also refers to the fact that the reason they did these things is because of the things described in verse 29. They rejected the knowledge that comes by way of the fear of the Lord. As a result, in verse 31, Solomon goes on to say that these people would eat of the fruit of their own way and be satiated with their own devices. Now, in this verse, Solomon is recording that as a result of the choices they made, those who rejected the voice of wisdom in the ways that's been described, they're going to get the product of it. They're going to get the consequences for their choices, in other words. Solomon also says they'll be satiated with their own devices. Now that word devices, it comes from a word that refers to plans. And it's applied here to say that those who rejected the voice of wisdom, they'd be filled up with their own plans, as opposed to the plans offered by the voice of wisdom. But this is all because of the choice they made in hating knowledge and not wanting to have the fear of the Lord. And so we come to verse 32. Solomon goes on to say that the waywardness of the naive will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. In this verse, Solomon is once again turning his attention to the naive and the fools he's already talked about in this chapter. And he's saying that this waywardness of the naive would result in their death, and the complacency had by fools would result in their destruction. So one thing we should understand here is that what Solomon calls the waywardness of the naive is the attitude had by these naive people, or the simple-minded. The naive wander because they choose to be in that condition. Now, the complacency of fools that Solomon mentions here is also an attitude had by foolish people. Foolish people are satisfied with where they're at. I want to stay where I am. I'm not going to make any effort to move on. That's complacency. You're foolish if you get complacent and just say, I'm good where I'm at. I don't want to move on and grow. Solomon applies that here to say that the end result of those attitudes is destruction. So putting verses 28 through 32 together, the point we should see from these verses before we get to verse 33 is that the voice of wisdom is called on and searched for. Solomon has shown that the voice of wisdom is something that not only calls out, but it's something that is called on. It's something that it's searched for. What these verses also show, however, is that if the voice of wisdom is going to respond, if it's going to be found, the person calling on it and searching for it must make a choice to love knowledge and to have a fear of the Lord. If you don't have these things, then it's impossible for the person to hear and find the voice of wisdom. But again, Solomon doesn't stop there. He makes a concluding remark in verse 33. He says, "But he who listens to me shall live securely and will be at ease from the dread of evil." Now in this verse, Solomon is now picturing the voice of wisdom as making a point that deals with the fact that a person who truly listens to the voice of wisdom will have a life of security and be able to be at ease from the dread of evil. So with that in mind, one thing we should understand here is that the idea of being at ease from the dread of evil, it's an idea that refers to having peace as a result of knowing that you don't need to be afraid of evil. Now, the reason the person who listens to the voice of wisdom does not need to be afraid of evil is because the voice of wisdom has instructed this person on how to deal with evil if and when it comes. So that being true, this should help us to understand that what is said here in verse 33, it doesn't mean you're going to have an easy life. You'll still have to deal with difficulties. Instead, what verse 33 means is that a person can be secure in this life, knowing that it's the voice of wisdom that will guide and direct this person through the evil things this life brings. But that is only true if a person chooses to listen to the voice of wisdom, which verse 29 tells us is a voice that instructs us to love knowledge and to have a fear of the Lord. If we listen to that voice, then we can rest securely knowing that we will never have to be afraid of the evil things this life brings. So when we consider everything that Solomon has recorded in verses 20 through 33 of this chapter in Proverbs, the point we should be left with is that the voice of wisdom is shouting, not just whispering quietly, but shouting. And since this voice of wisdom is shouting, it follows that the voice of wisdom asks questions. It's calling out. But it's also called on and searched for. And so the question is, will we respond to the voice of wisdom? What Solomon has recorded in these verses is a call for us to respond to the voice of wisdom. Again, that is not quietly calling, but instead is shouting in the street, lifting her voice in the square. Since that's true, these verses teach us that the voice of wisdom is something that's screaming for our attention, in the same way that a child sometimes screams for the attention of its parents. And so we have to ask ourselves, how will we respond to the shouting voice of wisdom? Today, this voice of wisdom can be heard through this book that we have in front of us today. But more importantly, this voice of wisdom can be heard not only through God's written word, but through his word that is personified in the person of Jesus. If you want to hear the voice of wisdom, go to Jesus, because he's calling out for our attention today, shouting for our attention. Jesus calls out for our attention. He called out on the cross for our attention when he said the things that he did on the cross. And so responding to the voice of wisdom is to respond to the voice of Jesus, who offers us true wisdom and true knowledge. And so again we ask, how will you respond to that voice? If you need to respond in any way, please come forward as we stand and sing. And as I remember to turn on the mic.
I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back, no turning back. Will not go with me, I still will follow. Will not go with me, I still will follow. Will not go with me. To follow Jesus, will you decide now to follow Jesus? Will you decide now to follow Jesus? No turning back, no turning back.
Moments for Lord's Supper is Psalm 376. 376. He paid a debt he did not owe. I owed a debt I could not pay. I needed someone to wash my sins away. And now I sing a brand new song, Amazing Grace. All day long, Christ Jesus paid the debt that I could never pay. He paid that debt at Calvary. He cleansed my soul and set me free. I'm glad that Jesus did all my sins erase. I now can sing a brand new song, Amazing Grace. All day long, Christ Jesus paid the debt that I could never pay. One day he's coming back for me to live with him eternally. Won't it be glory to see him on that day? I then will sing a brand new song, Amazing Grace. All day long, Christ Jesus paid the debt that I could never pay.
Brothers and sisters, pray with me. Our Father in heaven, we have a moment here now that we are honored to consider that a great gift that you gave us dying on the cross. You did it free and took so much love. We do this in memory of you. Once again, Father, we come before you. This represents the blood that was shed on the cross. This represents the sins that was forgiven. We ask, Father, that you do this. And that our hearts are in the right place and we receive this. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Father in heaven, we look around us. Everything that surrounds us is a blessing, Father. The ability to even speak is a blessing. To see, to feel, to be able to sit on these physical chairs and stand in a comfortable building is a blessing. This is a moment in time where we can give back freely and joyfully